All right, everybody, here we go. Caleb's still streaming. I hate to do this when he's streaming, but I gotta get to sleep. So I'm gonna go ahead and knock this out. We're finishing. There's Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 tonight, and I'm gonna go ahead and read the bibliography because I am a completionist. So it should take us about an hour and a half to finish this. I always go through a series of tests to make sure that my recording is correct. So if you don't listen to that, there should be a timestamp in the pinned comment below. You can skip right to the book. I'm also recording a high quality version in GarageBand, which I am going to edit all together. That'll take me about 4 or 5 hours to do after I record this, and then that'll be uploaded for posterity. So let's go through our series of tests. We are live. I have the book pulled up. I have Do Not Disturb on. I turned Bluetooth off on my Mac just so my headphones don't mess it up. Let's make sure the stream sounds okay. Let's see. Oh, here it is. Okay. How do I sound through the phone? It's a little bit of a lag. Not a very good connection tonight. Oh, I'm through the headphones still on my phone. How about now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm not getting anything out of my phone. Let's reopen it and see how that does. Oh, there I am. Okay. Having trouble loading. Let's go. Let's try it this way. There we go. No, it's working. Okay, let's make sure I can hear it in the left ear. Left ear, left ear. Left, left, left. Left, left, left. I'm good there. Okay. Let's do the right. Right, right, right. Right, right, right. I'm getting both. Golden. Okay. So we're good to go. Stream looks good. All right. So let's share the screen. Say goodbye to my beautiful face here. And we're going to the book. Appendix 1, timeline. All right. And then I just need to hit record in GarageBand. I got the Volt 276. My levels look good. Okay. Everything's good. So let's just hit record and start going here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, go. Appendix number 1, timeline, 1978 to 1981. At one point, when looking over the various literature published by the Workers' World Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party, I was forced to raise the question, why was so much of it published during the Carter administration? A huge amount of attention is given by leftist historians to the events that took place from 1968 up into the early 1970s. These were the years of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and the ensuing urban rebellions, the chaos at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, increasing unrest on college campuses, the rising influence of the Black Panthers, the election of Richard Nixon, COINTELPRO, the assassination of Fred Hampton, the music festival Woodstock, the collapse of Students for a Democracy Society, the Kent and Jackson State massacres, the trial of Angela Davis, and many other events that were rather pivotal in the history of U.S. radicalism. However, the events of a decade later are remembered by boomers with much less nostalgia. The economic downturn, followed by the Iranian and Nicaraguan revolutions, all culminated in the ascension of Ronald Reagan. These are the years when the new communist movement began to disintegrate, and the seeds of the fall of the USSR were being planted by what would be the color revolution industry. The world communist movement was in utter confusion. Leftist influence on U.S. political discourse was declining, and the late Cold War normal was setting in. Neoconservatism was setting up shop in Washington to become the primary ideological trend among the U.S. elite. However, having an understanding of the events of 1978 to 1981 is very important for those seeking to utilize divisions in the ruling class, build up some kind of revolutionary organization, construct a united front against the imperialists, and eventually move the United States towards socialism. In the process of digging into the history of various political movements in the United States, as well as geopolitical events, I was forced to compile this timeline of 1978 to 1981. A decade after the late 1960s political upsurge, Jimmy Carter was president. The U.S. economy was facing a downturn. The global communist movement was at the height of its strength, but also more divided and confused than it had been since 1917. U.S. foreign policy was being reshuffled by Brzezinski and Kissinger in light of the defeat in Vietnam. In essence, the Malthusian, ultra-rich Eastern establishment faced an explosive rebellion from lower-level capitalists and the military-industrial complex. The economic consequences of Carter's policies and the inability of the White House to build up public support for U.S. military interventions shook up Washington, D.C. Many of the hard-right anti-communists in the United States and around the world saw Carter's degrowth agenda as a threat to them. In the context of the Iranian and Nicaraguan revolutions and the U.S. proxy war with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, the lower levels of capital, with the aid of the Pentagon and the FBI, moved against Carter. Ronald Reagan moved from the far-right fringe of the Republican Party to become the primary candidate. Within the United States, various political and religious counter-gangs became chess pieces in an elaborate power struggle. Globally, many armed insurgent groups, intelligence-linked movements, and political figures were used in a similar manner. When the dust finally cleared, Reagan was president, but his anti-establishment right-wing tendencies had been tamed. The Carter-aligned wing of the U.S. deep state went into retreat and accepted its position as a kind of semi-loyal but ever-present opposition guiding academia and the intel apparatus. The fight did not reopen until 2008, when the U.S. economy crashed. With the ascendancy of Obama, Brzezinski and his crew were back in power in Washington, D.C., a fight that seemed to almost reach an armistice in 1981 reopened with a vigor and is now raging across America's headlines as the economy continues to crash and burn while Eurasia rises. In such a context, serious revolutionaries must look over this elaborate chain of events while contemplating what role we can play in our time and how to maneuver within this current crisis to stop the looming danger of a new world war and win justice for working families. 1978. January 1st, 1978. The book Dope Inc. is published by followers of Lyndon LaRouche. The text documents the role of the British Empire and U.S. intelligence agencies in promoting drug use from the 1600s up to today. April 30th, 1978. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan is declared following the Saur Revolution. May 7th, 1978. In Houston, Texas, the Moody Park riots erupt as local Chicanos rebel against police brutality. 3 members of the Revolutionary Communist Party are charged with inciting the riot, but their convictions are overturned on appeal. August 8th, 1978. A police attempt to evict members of the Black Radical Move organization in Philadelphia results in a shootout. The Move 9 are sent to prison as a result. October 9th, 1978. Korean businessman Tongsun Park testifies before Congress about allegations of illegal lobbying by the South Korean government in the United States. The Koreagate scandal. At the time, South Korea was headed by the military strongman Park Chung-hee, a hardline anti-communist and Bonapartist who is largely responsible for using state and military power to industrialize South Korea. November 2nd, 1978. U.S. Congress releases a 447-page document accusing Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the leader of the Unification Church, of violating U.S. tax and immigration law, money laundering, and illegally lobbying for the South Korean government. A widespread media campaign accuses the Unification Church of being a cult that brainwashes young Americans. November 13th, 1978. Strikes across Iran spread to the oil industry. Oil prices significantly rise as unrest spreads across the country, intensifying the ongoing U.S. energy crisis. November 18th, 1970. Followers of Reverend Jim Jones commit mass suicide in Guyana. 909 people drink cyanide on command. The People's Temple was a religious sect that operated in San Francisco and had ties to the leftist wing of the Democratic Party. Jones had taken his followers to Guyana after a media campaign revealed ugly details of the church's internal life. November 27th, 1978. San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Alderman Harvey Milk, both of whom had been supported by Jim Jones, are assassinated by a former police officer. Dianne Feinstein, who had run against Moscone, who she considered too far left, was sworn in as mayor of San Francisco in the aftermath of the assassinations. 1979. January 7th, 1979. Vietnamese forces, aligned with the Soviet Union, take Phnom Penh, and the U.S.-China-backed government of Pol Pot in Cambodia is forced to retreat. January 16th, 1979. The Shah of Iran flees the country amid an ongoing uprising. January 21st, 1979. 170 retired generals and admirals publish an ad in the New York Times condemning Jimmy Carter's SALT treaty with the Soviet Union and calling for an increase in military spending. January 25th, 1979. Revolutionary Communist Party, vandalizes the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. shortly after it opens, as the U.S. establishes diplomatic relations with China. January 29th, 1979. Revolutionary Communist Party holds a Death to Deng Xiaoping rally at the White House. 200 RCP members are arrested and charged. 2 RCP members run at Deng Xiaoping on White House grounds, waving Mao's Little Red Book after being given press credentials by the U.S. Air Force. February 1st, 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran from exile, greeted by thousands of supporters at the airport. 10 days later, the government collapses and the Islamic Revolution is declared victorious. May 21st, 1979. The former police officer who shot Harvey Milk and George Moscone in San Francisco is acquitted for murder and only convicted of voluntary manslaughter. He is given a 7-year sentence. At his trial, he used the infamous Twinkie defense, saying junk food had caused him to be mentally ill. San Francisco lights up with the White Night riots, and 140 people are injured as LGBT activists take to the streets, burning cars and attacking police. Police then raid gay bars in retaliation, beating and injuring many people. July 15th, 1979. Jimmy Carter delivers his Crisis of Confidence, aka Malaise speech, bemoaning the energy crisis, high cost of gas, and telling Americans that owning things will not make them happy. July 19th, 1979. The Sandinistas declare victory in Nicaragua, successfully toppling the U.S.-backed dictator Somoza after a 2-year civil war. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, is a broad coalition of leftist forces, and liberation theology is central to the beliefs of the new government, with Christian socialist language being added to the new constitutions. October 8th, 1979. The New York Times publishes a hit piece on Lyndon LaRouche with the headline, Labor Party on its erratic path. The article accuses him of anti-Semitism and running a terrorist training school. October 26th, 1979. South Korean military dictator Park Chung-hee is assassinated in his home by the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. The assassin is summarily executed, and the motive is unclear. November 1st, 1979. Walter Guevara, the elected president of Bolivia, is toppled by a U.S.-backed military coup. 100 protesters supporting him are killed in the All Saints' Day massacre shortly afterward. November 3rd, 1979. The Greensboro Massacre takes place in North Carolina. 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party are gunned down by the Ku Klux Klan on live TV. The Communists staged a Death to the Klan rally and sent the KKK a threatening letter challenging them to show up. The Communists agreed not to carry firearms when negotiating their parade permit with the local police. One of the Communists did not observe this rule and fired a pistol into the air when the KKK caravan was driving by. The KKK members then parked their car, got out their rifles, and opened fire on the Communists, killing 5 of them. November 4th, 1979. Iranian revolutionary youth seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking over 50 Americans hostage. Documents inside the embassy prove the U.S. was working to balkanize Iran by fomenting Kurdish and Arab separatist movements amid the revolutionary crisis. Patriotic anti-Iran rallies are mobilized across the United States, blaming Iran for rising gas prices, accusing Carter of being soft and weak, letting the U.S. be humiliated. November 13th, 1979. Ronald Reagan announces he is running for president for the third time, citing rising energy prices and economic mismanagement by Carter. Reagan calls for higher military spending. November 14th, 1979. Charges against RCP activists arrested at the Death to Deng Xiaoping rallies are dropped, but the decision is immediately appealed. November 17th, 1979. RCP announces support for the Iranian embassy takeover at a Washington, D.C. rally. RCP chairman Bob Avakian proclaims, "It's not our embassy. It's not even our fucking country. We just live here." RCP members began attending right-wing anti-Iran rallies and burning U.S. flags. This often results in the communists mobs of right-wingers. November 20th, 1979. Saudi Shia Muslims, inspired by the Islamic Revolution of Iran, seized control of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. One of the most holy sites in Islam is subject to a 2-week siege in which hundreds are killed before the Saudi government ultimately retakes the mosque and beheads the surviving revolutionaries. December 24th, 1979. Soviet troops arrive in Afghanistan to support the Democratic Republic against U.S.-backed Islamist insurgents. (1980) February 2nd, 1980. FBI launches Abscam sting operation, sending an FBI agent dressed as an Arab Sheikah to attempt to bribe elected officials. The target is smokestack Democrats who support nuclear power, have ties to labor unions, and don't support the degrowth policies of the Carter administration. February 10th, 1980. New Hampshire presidential primary puts Ronald Reagan into the position of frontrunner for the Republican nomination. Lyndon LaRouche put a very large effort into his Democratic primary campaign with paid TV programs, radio ads, winning 2,400 votes. LaRouche and Reagan appear on the stage together at a debate in January, seated next to each other, and interact in a friendly way. Reagan praises LaRouche as one of the more serious minor candidates with good ideas. March 8th, 1980. The first ever rock music festival in the Soviet Union takes place in Georgia, near the birthplace of Stalin. The intent of local Communist Party leaders is to help placate the privileged urban youth who were enamored with Western music and had been involved in nationalist anti-communist riots. March 21st, 1980. Jimmy Carter announces that the U.S. will boycott the Summer Olympics to protest the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. April 23rd, 1980. Reagan has a debate with his largest opponent, George H.W. Bush. Eventually, Reagan picks Bush as his vice presidential nominee in the name of unifying the party. Bush is seen as an Eastern establishment Rockefeller Republican with ties to the Trilateral Commission, as opposed to Reagan's hard right-wing populism and direct ties to the military-industrial complex. July 25th, 1980. David Duke resigns from the Ku Klux Klan and announces his intention to run for office. Rival Klansmen present the media with tapes in which he is heard offering to sell the list of KKK members' names and says derogatory things about those he has recruited. April 23rd, 1980. RCP member Damian Garcia is stabbed and killed in Los Angeles, several days after having ripped the U.S. flag down from the Alamo in Texas and put up a communist flag. Another RCP member, Hayden Fisher, is severely wounded in the attack. May 1st, 1980. The Revolutionary Communist Party calls a general strike for May 1st. Street fighting takes place in a number of major cities, with lots of arrests and injuries. RCP members burn U.S. flags and provoke a number of street fights with working-class Americans. May 18th, 1980. The Gwangju uprising breaks out in South Korea, demanding democratic rights and an end to the military dictatorship. Underground communist groups that support North Korea played a very significant role in the rebellion, but they were joined by many liberals who wanted an end to military rule. During the uprising, 22 soldiers and 165 protesters were killed, and 76 more protesters were disappeared by the military and never heard from again. July 1st, 1980, the Carter White House publishes Global 2000 report denouncing overpopulation and pushing forward the idea of limited resources being to blame for the energy crisis and global economic downturn. June 27th, 1980, Jimmy Carter announces that all U.S. males aged 18 to 25 must register for the draft, citing the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan as a cause. This order remains in effect. October 21st, 1980, Bob Avakian and 78 other RCP members have criminal charges against them reinstated for the death to Deng Xiaoping protests. October 31st, 1980, the Mariel boat lifts from Cuba officially end, with a total of 125,000 Cubans reaching Florida before the U.S. government and the Cuban government formally agree on ending the rapid transfer of citizens. Cuba had utilized the rescue operation arranged with the Carter administration to empty out its prisons and mental hospitals and to deport known anti-communists. U.S. officials had been scrambling to handle the influx of Cubans that was far higher than expected. November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan wins the U.S. presidential election in sweeping victory. During this election, Bernie Sanders is a registered elector for the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party candidate Andrew Pulley. November 20th, 1980, the Gang of Four are placed on trial for counter-revolutionary crimes by the Chinese Communist Party. In televised trials, the Chinese Communist Party repudiates the Cultural Revolution and makes clear it is transitioning away from the policies of the late Mao era. December 8th, 1980, John Lennon is assassinated outside of his apartment building in New York City. The former Beatles rock star had faced deportation proceedings during the 1970s and agreed to cease his political activism in exchange for being granted a permanent visa by the Nixon administration. Lennon had been associated with leftist politics, donating thousands of dollars to the Black Panthers in the United States and Jerry Healy's Workers' Revolutionary Party in Britain. Lennon had recently returned to the public eye after years of silence, releasing his first new album in 5 years, Double Fantasy. 1981. January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan is inaugurated as president. U.S. embassy hostages in Iran are released on the same day. It was later revealed that Reagan negotiated with Ayatollah Khomeini to keep the hostages from being released until he had taken office. March 1st, 1981. Irish political prisoners, led by Bobby Sands, launch hunger strikes demanding they not be treated as criminals but as prisoners of war. After 10 inmates die of starvation, the hunger strike is called off. The hunger strikes in Long Kesh prison generate a wave of support for the Irish freedom struggle. March 17, 1981. Prosecutors in Italy unveiled the existence of the P2 Masonic Lodge, a network of anti-communist activists based in Rome who were tied in with U.S. intelligence. The clandestine group had engaged in covert activities throughout the world. The Italian government resigned a few weeks later due to the massive scandalous revelations of illegal activities, manipulation of elections, weapons smuggling, terrorist attacks, and much more. March 30th, 1981. John Hinckley shoots Ronald Reagan failing to kill him. Hinckley is the son of an oil company executive with ties to the Bush family. Hinckley is later found not guilty for reasons of insanity. April 6th, 1981. Bernie Sanders is sworn in as mayor of Burlington, Vermont. April 11th, 1981. Riots take place in London. The unrest starts as a series of scuffles between black youth of Caribbean descent and the police. There was widespread looting of stores and thousands of injuries and arrests. The event is pivotal to the punk rock movement and is blamed on rising unemployment and stop-and-search police policies. May 3rd, 1981. Workers' World Party stages the People's Anti-War Mobilization protest in Washington, D.C., with backing from surrendered Weather Underground leaders Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn, the Communist Workers' Party, and a large number of Maoist groups and former 1960s radicals. The crowd of roughly 100,000 people marches from downtown D.C. to the Pentagon, chanting against Reagan and nuclear weapons and in support of various Marxist revolutionary groups around the world. Workers' World Party inserts its hardline politics, giving the march a more radical character than the national protests of the previous decade. This is the first national anti-war protest with a Palestinian speaker and the first national anti-war protest with a gay rights speaker. During the rally, 300 followers of Reverend Sun Myung Moon disrupted by chanting, "No more Cuba, no more war, Castro out of El Salvador." The scuffle between the Unification Church members and the Workers' World Party team of marshals results in multiple injuries. June 7th, Israel bombs Iraq's nuclear power facility, killing Iraqi scientists and a French citizen. The nuclear power facility in Iraq was being constructed in coordination with the French government nuclear power program. Israel justifies the attack, arguing the Ba'athist government was dangerous and could have potentially developed nuclear weapons. Iraq was a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and no evidence of nuclear ambitions from the Iraqi government has ever been presented. At the time, the United States was actively backing Iraq in its war against Iran. July 23rd, 1981. John Africa, leader of the MOVE organization, is acquitted in Philadelphia on charges of owning illegal weapons and conspiracy. Despite having never completed high school and being illiterate, John Africa represents himself with no attorney and wins the jury over to acquitting him. Sam Marcy of Workers' World Party sits in the courtroom during the trial, along with future U.S. political prisoner Mumia Abu Jamal. September 19th, 1981. The AFL-CIO holds a massive Solidarity Day demonstration to protest against Reagan's use of the Taft-Hartley law to break the air traffic controllers strike. This is the first national protest called by labor unions in U.S. history, and roughly 500,000 labor union members gather in Washington, D.C. to denounce the Reagan administration. October 15th, 1981. Reverend Sun Myung Moon is indicted for filing a false tax return and criminal conspiracy. Despite all the innuendo in the press and accusations of much more serious crimes, the actual charges are quite mild. Moon is eventually convicted, given a much more harsh sentence than usual, and imprisoned for 13 months. November 23rd, 1981. Ronald Reagan signs a secret order authorizing CIA to begin arming Contras in Nicaragua in their armed campaign to overthrow the socialist government. Afterwards, June 4th, 1982. Charges against Bob Avakian are dropped in exchange for 10 other RCP members pleading guilty to felony charges. Avakian flees the U.S. for France, where he seeks political exile status, not returning to the USA until 2004. March 23rd, 1983. Ronald Reagan gives his Star Wars speech referencing LaRouche's strategic defense initiative of ending the arms race with laser beam weapons. May 13th, 1985. In the infamous Move House bombing, 11 people, including John Africa, are killed when the Philadelphia Police Department destroys a house with a firebomb dropped from a helicopter. October 14th, 1988. Lyndon LaRouche and 6 associates are indicted on mail fraud and conspiracy to commit mail fraud and eventually sent to prison. Appendix 2. 3 Socialist Movements and the Global Crisis We Now Face. This piece was originally published as an introduction to a new edition of Engels' classic pamphlet, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, released by the Center for Political Innovation in 2023. You are holding in your hands a new edition of one of the most important pieces of writing in the history of politics, economics, and arguably in the history of the world. The concepts were unoriginal. The author, Friedrich Engels, simply articulated what Karl Marx had developed in decades of writing and taught him over the course of years of collaboration. While Marx was a brilliant, innovative thinker, as he cut new ground and gave birth to a revolutionary new understanding of human events, his writing style was highly polemical and difficult for many in the mass audience to understand. Engels had the task of spelling out Marx's concepts in much plainer language. Marx's work began in the field of philosophy when he became an outspoken interpreter and espouser of the teachings of Friedrich Hegel. Marx moved into political activism, composing the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and eventually forming the First International. Marx spent the final years of his life focusing on economics, utilizing the statistical information compiled by the British government in London. Friedrich Engels was a young radical and intellectual who met Marx and became his lifelong collaborator, ally, and patron. Teaching through polemic. In 1877, socialism was very popular in Marx's home country of Germany. However, it was not the socialism of Karl Marx, but the socialism of a long-forgotten intellectual mystic man named Eugen Dühring that dominated academia. With Marx's help, Engels composed a polemic against the socialism of Dühring, ripping it to shreds and explaining Marx's scientific understanding. Engels' magnum opus, Anti-Dühring, expanded from a simple polemic to a full history of socialist thought, philosophy, and explanation of historical materialism. The title was an homage of Julius Caesar's book, Anti-Cato. In 1880, as socialist movements and organizations influenced by Marx's ideas were popping up across Europe, aligning themselves with the emerging labor movement, Engels abridged and edited Anti-Dühring into a much shorter 3-chapter pamphlet called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. This short pamphlet educated millions of Germans, Britons, Frenchmen, Belgians, and others as they became organized into the various labor, social democratic, and workers' parties that made up the Socialist Second International. The pamphlet's first chapter is dedicated to honoring the great utopian socialist thinkers that predated Marx. Many confused readers misinterpret the opening chapter as criticism, but it's hardly that. Engels praises in glowing terms those who saw that the brave new world, created by the French Revolution and the English Civil War, was filled with injustice and inhumanity. Engels explains, in a word, compared with the splendid promises of the philosophers, the social and political institutions born of the triumph of reason were bitterly disappointing caricatures. All that was wanting was the men to formulate this disappointment, and they came with the turn of the century. Marx and Engels did not see Robert Owen and Saint Simon as naive and primitive, but as heroic, moral people who wanted to correct the injustices they saw around them and were disappointed by the results of the revolutions that toppled feudalism. Ingalls describes the various idealistic communities created in Europe and America, similar to the communes and worker cooperatives of today. He writes, "To the crude conditions of capitalistic production and the crude class conditions correspond crude theories. The solution of the social problems, which as yet lay hidden in undeveloped economic conditions, the utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. To remove these was the task of reason. It was necessary, then, to discover a new and more perfect system of social order and to impose this upon society from without by propaganda, and wherever it was possible, by the example of model experiments." Ingalls points out that even though these communities reorganized production on more egalitarian lines, they still operated within the context of a capitalist society. They could not overcome the society around them, and they could not overturn capitalism simply by example or logical arguments. The second chapter of the pamphlet is dedicated to philosophy. Ingalls describes how thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, and that all that exists in the world is matter. He upholds the philosophical tradition called materialism in opposition to idealism, a debate that goes back to the classical era. Ingalls then points out that all the world is in a constant state of change and conflict. History is driven forward by contradiction, opposing social forces clashing into each other, driving civilization forward to higher ends. These concepts are called historical and dialectical materialism, and they comprise the Marxist philosophical understanding. Because the utopians were not armed with this outlook, but stuck in religious idealism, they could not overcome capitalism. The third and final chapter explains how history is moving forward constantly, from hunter-gathering civilization to slavery to feudalism and to capitalism. Human beings are in a constant drive to reach a higher plane of existence, a more advanced mode of production. Ingalls then explains that capitalism is holding back human progress. He describes the problem of poverty amid plenty, the crisis of overproduction, and why the irrational profit motive restricts the drive to create a more prosperous society. He then explains that the working class, the proletariat, has the historical duty of first winning the battle for democracy and seizing government power from the rich. From there, it must turn the means of production into public property and allow them to function on a rational basis. Liberating the economy from the irrationalism of the market will be the ultimate triumph of man over nature and will lead to an egalitarian, stateless, classless world. This vision of socialism was contrary to the conservative, mystical, and German nationalist socialism of Eugen Düring. Düring was an adherent of Henry Carey and Friedrich List and believed socialism would be achieved with a popular government balancing a harmony of interests and ruling for the good of society. Unlike his allies List and Carey, Düring was anti-Semitic and presented Jews as immoral, selfish outsiders who corrupted society. While Düring was an atheist and critic of religion, presenting himself as scientific and modern, he saw socialism as a reassertion of morality and tradition and rejected class struggle. Marx and Engels saw the labor movement as the greatest expression of their ideas in practice, while Düring saw his ideas put forward in German nationalism. 1. Marx, Engels, and internationalist socialism. In order to give context to this important pamphlet and explain why it is so vital in our times, it is important to go over how the ideas of Marx, Engels, and Düring developed over the course of the 20th century and how they fit into the 21st century. The socialism that exists in the world today is not the socialism of Marx and Engels, though it is heavily influenced by them and often claims their heritage. While it is not Marx and Engels' socialism, it is certainly not the socialism of Düring either. There have in reality been three distinct socialist movements in modern history, and only one of them has ever created non-capitalist societies. Understanding the three socialist movements and their impact will lay the basis for understanding why this very old pamphlet is so important in our times, and why the Center for Political Innovation has chosen to republish it now. Marx spent his life promoting the teachings summarized by Engels in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. Marx was not an armchair revolutionary or ivory tower intellectual by any means. He built the International Workingmen's Association, or the First International. He fought on the barricades and organized strikes. He served as the London correspondent for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, the Republican Party-aligned newspaper of New York City during the U.S. Civil War. Marx organized textile workers in London to refuse to work with cotton picked by slaves, and gave political guidance to August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, members of the First International who served as high-ranking members of the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Marx's followers joined with other socialists in 1871 to seize control of France's capital and establish the short-lived Paris Commune. This was a revolutionary, working-class government which Marx described as the first historical example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the workers were storming heaven. The portrayal of Marx in recent films and the widespread misconception that he was some kind of socially isolated academic is poppycock. Marx spent his life as an activist and organizer, and his work was intended to give guidance to real organizations of people aligned with real social forces to bring about real change in the world. Marx's primary political opponents within the First International were anarchists, and ultimately, the international organization Marx built collapsed due to political disagreements between Marx and the anarchists. When Marx died in 1883, he left behind a huge body of work published after a lifetime of organizing and writing, composed as he and his family lived in poverty and fled from country to country. It was due to Marx's valuable insight and understanding of how human events developed and the effectiveness of the methods of thought he promoted that the emerging labor movement became dominated by adherents of Marxism. By the late 1880s and into the 1890s, Marxism had exploded across Europe. Millions of German workers joined labor unions and voted for the Social Democratic Party. The labor movement of workers on the job in France, Britain, Austria, and many other countries gave birth to a political expression in the form of parties that sought to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism. Members of parliament were elected, trade unions were formed, and popular reforms were won. Stabilizing the West, setting the stage for imperialism. The socialism of Marx and Engels was internationalist. It said, "Workers of the world, unite!" It rejected nationalism and said that the working people of Europe and the entire world shared a common destiny. The socialist movement favored free trade because it would lead to bringing workers together, expanding the global economy, bringing the advancements of the West to the colonized world, and laying the basis for the global revolution. The socialist movement wanted votes for women, the separation of church and state, the abolition of monarchies, and the further battering down of any remnants of feudalism. By the time the 20th century rolled around, it became clear that the Second International and the socialism of Marx and Engels was not going to create a revolution in Europe. In fact, it had largely contributed to enabling European capitalism to dominate the planet. Socialists won universal male suffrage, 12-hour workdays, and union representation on the job. In Germany, they won the creation of a national health care service and government daycare programs. In all the major Western countries, the Marxist-led labor movement had created a layer of well-paid, skilled workers who saw their living standards go up as their capitalist bosses expanded across the planet. Though the benefits and higher wages these skilled workers received had been won on the picket line, their higher living standards cemented their loyalty to the Western capitalist governments. The fact that socialists were elected and had roles at the highest level of government also helped embed the aristocracy of labor into the Western capitalists' government apparatus. As Western capitalist banks and corporations began dominating the planet with the export of capital, i.e., looting the third world and holding back development, the higher paid workers were loyal and obedient, and their labor unions and socialist parties were necessary to pull them along in the process. As capitalism entered the phase Lenin would later call imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it could not be disputed that the internationalist socialist movement of Marx and Engels had been essential for making it happen. The Marxists had forced industrial capitalists to pay higher wages and create the aristocracy of labor among the workers that would be comfortable and loyal to the empire. The Marxists had forced the state to adopt social programs that made life more livable for the working class. The Marxists had championed free trade, enabling Western corporations to spread their tentacles across the planet. Lenin's angry polemics from Russia fumed with rage against the Second International, which he declared to be a stinking corpse. While all the Marxist parties of Europe had pledged never to support a war, never to vote to send working people to kill their class brothers, when the guns of August roared in 1914, they all betrayed their pledge. The rage of Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg in their heated polemics comes from their knowledge of the fact that the socialist movement had devolved into an essential part of the Western capitalist power structure. It was only because of the collaboration of various socialists that the horrific event known as World War I could have taken place. 20 million workers were sent to their deaths as the colonial powers and ultra monopolies of Europe fought over control of Asia, Africa, and South America. The bulk of the socialist movement had largely turned its back on Eugene Debs, Rosa Luxemburg, Frank Little, and other heroic working class organizers who refused to be social imperialists and support the war. Lenin's Bolshevik organization in Russia, formed in 1903 as a party of new type, had long been rejected by the Second International. Its methods of democratic centralism, agitprop, and demanding a dedicated cadre who gave the whole of their lives drew heavily from Russia's tradition of secret societies and clandestine organizing, such as the Decembrists and the Old Believers. Its methods seemed authoritarian and cultish to the European intellectuals who favored transparency and widespread debate. Its methods for seizing power, which ultimately succeeded, were dismissed as coup plotting and conspiracy rather than the mass strike methods pursued by the Western labor movement. Communists around the world recognized that Bolshevism succeeded in Russia, taking power in 1917, because it was a distinct political movement that had broken with many of the major beliefs of Marx and Engels' scientific internationalist socialist movement. Lenin embraced nationalism and said the colonized world would be the primary battlefield against capitalism in the 20th century. Lenin had even taken funding from German intelligence when he returned to Russia in April of 1917. He had changed the official name of the Bolshevik Party to the Communist Party, rejecting the label of Social Democratic in order to differentiate himself from the European labor parties who had become mere appendages of imperialism. As Bolshevism and the Communist International emerged following the Russian Revolution, the remnants of the international socialism started by Marx and Engels have become more and more integrated into the Western imperialist power structure and less revolutionary in their content. The push for liberal reforms came from various think tanks and policy-making entities like the Round Table Group, established by the estate of British colonialist Cecil Rhodes, of which today's Council on Foreign Relations is a descendant. The voices who pushed for reforms were the likes of H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, and the Fabian Society, intellectuals cultivated by the ultra-rich to craft a managerial agenda to ensure the dominance of Western capitalism over the planet. It was the Rockefeller oil monopolists in the United States who backed Roosevelt, while Henry Morgan, Henry Ford, and the National Association of Manufacturers sought his ouster. These ultra-rich monopolists had a more globalist outlook and saw stabilizing reforms as a necessary method of securing social peace. The labor movement and social democracy enabled them to help make it happen, despite having a very different stated goal. The United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and so many of the institutions that express the will of Western capitalism and its platitudes about human rights in our time are staffed with socialists of the non-revolutionary internationalist variety. Tony Blair, Francois Hollande, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez all see socialism as nothing more than the sum of reforms. Socialism is free healthcare, free college, transgender bathrooms, and rock stars performing John Lennon's Imagine on New Year's Eve in Times Square. The first socialist movement ultimately failed because capitalism moved into its imperialist monopoly stage, with Western finance capitalists making super profits, dominating the entire planet. In order to do it, they needed to integrate the economy more closely with the state, and they needed a limited welfare state to stabilize society at home. The movement of Marx and Engels largely turned into its opposite. Two, the legacy of Düring, right-wing National Socialism. But what of Eugene Düring and his non-materialist, moralistic socialism that condemned Jews and glorified the German nation-state? In the late years of the 19th century, it certainly faded into the background as the labor movement and social democracy took center stage. One can see elements of a more Düringist socialism in the work of Edward Bellamy, the popular American socialist who wrote the science fiction novel Looking Backward in 1888 and built nationalist clubs to promote socialism in the United States. One can also hear echoes of Düringism in the words of some of the religious fanatics who built up the bulk of the radical abolitionist current that opposed slavery. The Communist Manifesto of 1848 gave special attention to reactionary socialism and various forms of right-wing anti-capitalism. It wasn't really until after the First World War that right-wing anti-capitalism began suddenly to expand in popularity. The German Social Democratic Party more or less took power following the First World War, and at the Constitutional Convention held in Weimar, they refused to establish a socialist government. When Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht continued fighting for a socialist republic, they were ruthlessly murdered. While the new Bolshevik brand of Marxism had taken power in Russia, the Marxism and leftism of Europe seemed stale. Its moment had come following the First World War, and it had failed. Its mass parties became less and less revolutionary in their rhetoric. But in Italy, Benito Mussolini seized power in his 1922 March on Rome. The Italian strongman had been a member of the Socialist Party, but had been an enthusiastic supporter of the First World War and was heavily influenced by the teachings of the French syndicalist Georges Sorel. Mussolini had formed the Black Shirts as a group of street-fighting strikebreakers who espoused an ideology that mixed Italian nationalism, mystical admiration for ancient Rome, along with both anti-communism and anti-capitalism. Mussolini wrote that the wheels of history are turned through blood. He ridiculed the Italian socialists for failing to seize power in a revolution and condemned the more radical Bolshevik groups as a foreign conspiracy from Russia. He put forward a model of a corporate state in which the government and private industrialists coordinated their actions in order to manage the economy. Fascism was super capitalism, according to Mussolini. His government created an authoritarian state that crushed the labor movement and stimulated the economy by spending huge amounts of money on weapons manufacturing and maintaining a very large police force and apparatus of repression. In Germany, various right-wing anti-capitalist thinkers emerged. The most prominent was Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, Form and Actuality. Spenglerism argued that capitalism and socialism are two sides of the human spirit. Capitalism represents individualism and the drive to make money, while socialism represents obedience to authority and loyalty to one's tribe. Spengler argued that Europe was in decline due to weakness and lack of authoritarianism, as well as radical individualism. Ernst Jünger, a fanatical German militarist, drew heavily from Spengler's work, coining his own concept of Prussian socialism. This was a highly militarized state in which loyalty to the nation and religion overrode profits and individualism. Factory owners and degrowth. The Nazis who seized power in 1933 drew heavily from Spengler and Juncker, though they ultimately disagreed with many of their ideas. The Nazis were populists who put forward the notion of a people's revolution to reignite the flame of German greatness that had been extinguished after the First World War. The right-wing anti-capitalism of Spengler and Jünger rejected the very concept of popular movements. It argued that people should be subservient and aspiring to do the will of their leaders, and that the notion of mass political movements or politicians who aspire to win the people's approval was at the heart of Europe's decline. Friedrich Nietzsche was always firmly opposed to any type of socialism, declaring socialism to be a modernized version of Christianity, the cry of vengeance from the poor and oppressed against the strong. The Nazis drew from Nietzsche and his worship of strength, and his belief that modern society was becoming soft and restraining the Übermenschen from ruling over their supposed natural inferiors. The writer William Preston points out interestingly that Nietzsche never studied the work of Marx and Engels, but based his critique of socialism solely on the work of Dühring, who focused much more on envy and moral indignation. For in Dühring, Nietzsche sees this scabrous, festering wound of a man who comes to the fore in every socialist society. The case of the arrogant, immoderate, and anti-Semitic Berlin professor affords the psychologist a clear view of the sediment in the base of the depths of soul of the rabble. Dühring discloses the ugly psychological truth of socialism. For Nietzsche's anti-socialism stems not from Nietzsche's reaction to the specific ideas of this or that prophet of resentment, but from Nietzsche's joyous affirmation that exploitation is essential to life. However, Just as the internationalist socialism of Marx and Engels eventually deteriorated into the ideology of bankers, stabilizing Western societies so capitalism could expand into its monopoly stage of imperialism, the right wing National Socialism of Juncker, Spengler, the Nazis, and others also never led to the creation of a non capitalist society. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were Bonapartist regimes in which factory owners and the government teamed up to heavily regulate the economy. Hitler was brought to power primarily because of Hjalmar Schacht, the economist and financier who resented the power of British and American banks, but also feared a working class revolution. Fascism in the 1930s was the ideology of factory owners in their rivalry with oil monopolists and financiers, and their desperate drive to crush labor unions. In America, Charles Coughlin and the Black Legion condemned capitalism as unchristian and immoral as they mobilized against the set-down strike wave of 1937. They continued the work of those who had conspired in the 1933 business plot for a military coup against Roosevelt. The Silver Legion of America, led by William Dudley Pelley, functioned as strikebreakers, preaching religious and esoteric anti-communism while condemning capitalism. They put forward a vision of a Christian commonwealth where religious principles would govern the economy and a supposed Jewish conspiracy against America would be eradicated. The primary way the Nazis were able to reboot their economy in 1933 was with forced degrowth. The Nazis broke the labor movement and created a network of prison camps for social democrats and communists. This took hundreds of thousands of workers out of the job market and solved unemployment. They then stimulated the economy by supplying the concentration camp inmates as slave labor for Germany's wealthy corporations. The Nazis also relaunched military spending and began pouring huge amounts of money into building a huge military apparatus. The Nazis created the world's first prison industrial complex and then the first military industrial complex. Like social democracy, National Socialism ultimately became a vehicle for attempting to stabilize Western capitalism. The Nazis launched the Second World War in an attempt to re-seize the colonies German imperialism had lost at the Treaty of Versailles and assert domination over the European mainland, of which the German imperialists had long contended with the British in geopolitical intrigue. One fascist thinker of Italian origin, Julius Evola, expressed the essence of right-wing anti-capitalism in his book, Man Among the Ruins, Post-War Reflections of a Radical Traditionalist, published shortly after the Second World War. Evola wrote about the demonic nature of the economy. He argued that the problem with capitalism was not that it was holding back growth and progress, but rather that it necessitated it. Evola wrote glowingly about the Dalai Lama's feudal society in Tibet and the Indian caste system, arguing that capitalism should be abolished and replaced with a strictly hierarchical society in which people do not want more than they already have, and the Buddhist ideal of all things in balance is realized by tradition. During the Second World War, the horrors of degrowth as a mechanism for attempting to stabilize capitalism were revealed to the world. The Nazis' final solution of exterminating millions of people and their demented and cruel eugenics experiments shocked humanity. The rejection of any sense of morality, as called for by Nietzsche, seemed to be enacted. The utter inhuman cruelty of the blonde beast, birthed by capitalism entering its imperialist monopoly stage, was largely revealed by forces who operated in the name of National Socialism. 3. The Russian and Chinese Revolutions, Continental Constructive Socialism. Unlike the internationalist socialism of Marx and Engels that gave birth to modern leftism and social democracy, and the right-wing anti-capitalism of Düring that laid the ideological basis for fascism, the type of socialism that has actually come into existence and created a non-capitalist society is of a third distinct category. It certainly draws heavily from Marx and Engels. Prior to the Russian Revolution, both the Bolsheviks and the Western Marxist movement understood their ideas were not the same. The differences became even more acute after the revolution, when Karl Kautsky began attacking the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin responded with his pamphlet, Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Lenin accused Kautsky of glossing over how violent and undemocratic Western liberal capitalist societies were in his outrage that the Bolsheviks had not complied with democratic norms and did as he did in Germany by joining a constituent assembly. The mainstream of Western Marxism objected to the fact that Bolsheviks and their ideological adherents were a minority of Russian society, but yet they took it upon themselves to seize the reins of power and direct the population. This was deemed undemocratic. However, the Bolsheviks saw themselves as morally justified, and much of the Russian population agreed with them. When society enters a state of chaos and unrest, there is a feeling that some faction needs to take responsibility and step up to lead, bringing order out of the chaos. Waiting around for a semi-consensus or the articulation of approval from a clear majority of the population would be irresponsible. The chaos following Tsar Nicholas's abdication and deep divisions in Russian society regarding the First World War and the economic crisis necessitated someone stepping in to declare themselves the new boss. Lenin did it and was able to mobilize an army and political machine behind him. This alone made him worthy to lead in the eyes of much of the population. Order and stability was valued over a democratic mandate. The strength to get the job done and bring order was deemed more important than any ideological qualifications. The ideology of the Bolsheviks was complex. It was a unique interpretation and application of Marxist theories that had been developed from 1903 to 1917. It strayed from classical Marxism in several key areas. The Bolsheviks did not expect for the majority of the population to understand their ideas or even be won over to them. They rather expected the population to see them as effective leaders who could get the job done and deliver the goods. Just as average people do not understand all the intricacies of biology in the way a trained biologist might, the average citizen was not expected to understand all the intricacies of statecraft and political economy. This was the field of work that the members of the ruling party had taken on, and it was their job to understand its complexities and methods. This approach is very Confucian and more or less non-Western. Confucian and more or less non-Western. The Bolshevik Revolution was the first step in the socialist movement leaving Europe and becoming a vehicle for the previously colonized world to express its independence and desire for independent economic development. Asiatic socialism. The break between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin is even more telling. Trotsky held on to the Eurocentrism of Marx and Engels. He believed the only hope for Soviet Russia was to serve as a base area to spread the revolution to the industrialized West. His theory of permanent revolution argued that countries in the developing world were too backward to have socialism, and that socialism could really only emerge in the Western imperialist homelands. Stalin argued that the USSR could have socialism in one country, and with 5-year economic plans, it could build itself into a modern industrial country. In his biography, Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence, Trotsky refers to Stalin as Asiatic, saying this refers to blending of grit, shrewdness, craftiness, and cruelty which has been considered characteristic of the statesmen of Asia. He quotes Nikolai Bukharin, referring to Stalin as Genghis Khan. The political and economic model that Stalin pioneered was certainly not Western and synthesized a number of competing tendencies. It involved the conservatism and patriotism of the peasantry, the nationalism of countries kept impoverished by the domination of foreign capital, the passionate drive for reform, science, and modernization found among third world intellectuals, the ritual and semi-religious personality worship of traditional monarchies, the rage of entire nations at centuries of oppression and humiliation, and most of all, the desire for historical progress and advancement. The model of a one-party state that built up state-run industries, wiped out illiteracy, electrified countries, and constructed collective farm systems has been labeled Stalinism by Western academics. This model made Russia into a superpower that invented space travel, defeated the Nazis, electrified vast swaths of the planet, and constructed the largest power plants and steel mills the world had ever seen. This model was applied in China after the 1949 revolution, across Eastern Europe following the Second World War, and in many countries that broke free from Western domination in the post-war years. The Chinese Revolution was not simply the exporting of Bolshevism to China. Mao Zedong thought had unique organizing methods that were China-specific. The strategy of focusing on the peasantry had been rejected by the Bolsheviks and taken up by the Neurondics, their ideological rivals. But this was the road to power for the communists, who were able to transform China into a prosperous superpower. In the second half of the 20th century, socialism became more and more ideologically divergent. African socialism was pioneered by leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Tanzania's Julius Nyerere. Ba'athist Arab socialism emerged as a mass movement after Michel Aflaq broke with the Syrian Communist Party in the 1930s. This movement took roots among the military and eventually gave political leadership to Iraq and Syria. Libya's Islamic socialism was unique, and the 1979 revolution in Nicaragua brought to power a group of radical Christians called the Sandinistas. The Islamic Revolution of Iran officially rejected Marxism, but instead pushed for not capitalism, but Islam. After taking power, Ruhollah Khomeini took a page from Stalin and launched a construction jihad, a mass mobilization of the population for rapid industrialization, much like the 5-year plans that defined the Stalinist economic model. This new socialism was not about class struggle in the same way that Marx and Engels had spoken of it. The new governments spoke in the name of the proletariat and peasantry, but their goal was not to tear down some for the benefit of the others. The focus was on utilizing rational central planning to raise up the entire country. This new socialism was not nationalist or conservative in the same way fascism had been. It was not reinforcing social hierarchies, holding caste systems and authoritarian structures together as Spengler and Younger had called for. It was not about rebooting the economy with degrowth and destruction, marching closer to war as the Nazis had done. It was the opposite. The socialist governments empowered women, pushed forward youth, and mobilized all of society around a vision of economic growth and expansion. The Cultural Revolution in China and the China, the Great Terror episode of mass fear and political repression in the USSR were seen as dark moments that stained the overall optimism the governments pushed forward. As the socialist countries faced the problem of being surrounded and locked out of the Western economies, Deng Xiaoping reinvented their economic model to utilize foreign investment and build up a domestic private sector, all while maintaining the hegemony of the Communist Party and its central planners over the economy. The success of socialism with Chinese characteristics in lifting people out of poverty, raising living standards, and pushing a huge country forward is something that cannot be denied. With state-run banks, 5-year economic plans, and a ruling Communist Party, China has surged to amazing heights. While the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were unable to adjust, the socialist-oriented market economy of Vietnam and micro-entrepreneurship programs of Nicaragua have been highly successful. The 21st century model of an economy where state planning gets priority, with credit and natural resources under state control, along with a market sector that is subsidized to enact the state's overall vision, has been highly successful, even more successful than the mass industrialization and modernization socialism carried out in the 20th century. The political reshuffling. While this new form of socialism speeds forward across the formerly colonized world, the old socialisms continued to just function as a defense of the old order. Social democracy was usurped by the cultural movement called the New Left, a response to the expansions in information technology. Zbigniew Brzezinski argued in his book, Between Two Ages, America Enters the Technotronic Era, that rather than suppressing the New Left, the U.S. government should hijack it and utilize its destabilizing influence to work against the Soviet Union. This strategy seems to have dominated U.S. intelligence circles in the late Cold War and largely helped the USA manipulate the Eastern Bloc, culminating in the events of 1989 to 1991. In the new economic conditions of the post-World War II years, most of the fascists and far-right elements embraced capitalism and declared that the ultra-rich bankers and monopolists were somehow communists. The declared goal became to defend the real capitalism of industrialists and small business owners from the corporatism of big monopolies. While right-wing anti-capitalist demagogy prevailed among the various military juntas of the Third World that had U.S. backing against the Soviet Union, in the West, right-wing anti-capitalism became almost completely forgotten. In the world of today, there is a block of resistance to Western capitalism. In Russia, it is led by Vladimir Putin, who rebooted Russia's economy by centralizing it around two state-controlled energy corporations. Putin's economic reforms, asserting state control and repudiating the neoliberal policies of Yeltsin, rescued Russia and restored its industrial base. The Soviet ideology is a big influence on contemporary Russia, but so are the thousands of years of Russian civilization that predate it. The new Russian patriotism that honors the Tsars and the Soviet Red Army together complements the ideological orientation of Chinese communism, where today Mao and Confucius walk hand in hand as part of China's unique history and non-Western identity. The Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Bolivarian countries of Latin America, the Houthis in Yemen, leaders of Zimbabwe, Angola, and Eritrea all espouse their own brand of anti-capitalism rooted in their unique historical experience and circumstances. While they are all different, they are all neither purely Marxian or Duringist. They are also all focused on the importance of economic growth and optimism in the face of pessimistic confusion and economic neoliberalism coming from the West. Russian academic Alexander Dugin wrote of the fourth political theory, arguing that after liberal democracy, the first political theory, failed to be defeated by communism and fascism, the second and third political theories, that a new fourth political theory was emerging in Russia and other centers of resistance to Western capitalism. Dugin gave voice to this understanding that the wave of resistance to Western capitalism that was spawned by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 has moved beyond Western political categories in the 21st century. As Dugin observed, it draws from the Marxist critique of capitalism and imperialism, but also from the nationalism and traditionalism of the right wing. It rejects Western free markets and impoverishment, as well as Western postmodernism and cultural decay. Atlanticism versus the city-building tendency. What is called 21st century socialism in Latin America and the axis of resistance in the Middle East is the political expression of a new economic order that stands in opposition to the Western capitalist system. Lenin's book, Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, described how capitalism was becoming dominated by finance and trusts, cartels, and syndicates based in Western countries that were actively holding back economic development. The Western capitalist system evolved into imperialism, in which Western capitalists became the middlemen in global trade. When one looks at the work of Henry Carey and his critique of the British Empire and its economic relationship with the world, the roots of this setup become clear. Henry Carey, the chief economic advisor to U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, wrote, "Two systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which for trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital good profits. One looks to increasing the quantity of raw materials to be exported and diminishing the inducements to the import of men, thus impoverishing both farmer and planter by throwing on them the burden of freight, while the other looks to increasing the import of men and diminishing the export of raw materials, thereby enriching both planter and farmer by relieving them from the payment of freight. One looks to give the products of millions of acres of land and of the labor of millions of men for the service of hundreds of thousands of distant men, the other to bring the distant men to consume on the land the products of the land, exchanging days' labor for days' labor. One looks to compelling the farmers and planters of the Union to continue their contributions for the support of the fleets and the armies, the paupers, the nobles, and the sovereigns of Europe, the other to enabling ourselves to apply the same means to the moral and intellectual improvement of the sovereigns of America. One looks to the continuance of that has fared freedom of trade, which denies the principle of protection, yet doles it out as revenue duties. The other to extending the area of ultimate free trade by the establishment of perfect protection, allowed by the annexation of individuals and communities, and ultimately by the abolition of custom houses. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war, the other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them, the other to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. This English system of ultra monopolists dominating trade routes and grinding the world into poverty is also spelled out in the 1890 book written by U.S. naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, was embraced by the British, American, and German governments. It argued that control of the trade routes could lead to the centralization of wealth in the hands of certain nations. It favored building up a military to serve to control international markets at the expense of investing in infrastructure and the physical economy of the mainland. This was a model very similar to that of the Roman Empire. It was said all roads lead to Rome because the Romans, with their huge army and navy, served as the middleman in global trade, extracting tribute and slaves from every nation. Meanwhile, their ability to grow their own crops and produce their own products became diminished and weaker the larger their empire became. Up until the point when the mighty city-state could no longer even muster its own army and was forced to hire foreigners to fight its wars in its final years. This model of global trade is rightly called Atlanticism, and it is not an outgrowth of some conspiracy, but rather the natural result of capitalism moving to the stage of globalism. The roots of Atlanticism are not found in immoral thoughts, but in the natural workings of the capitalist economy. Atlanticism, like the Roman Empire in its final years, seeks to hold back historical progress and technological advancement. The rulers of the Atlanticist global order more or less feel that the human race must halt its historical advance and not strive to a higher technological plane because this would lead to them being displaced. The world must stay poor so that they can stay rich. Meanwhile, what Henry Charles Carey called the American system, what Marx observed in capitalism's early years as it industrialized the Western nations, what Alexander Dugin calls Eurasianism, what Stalin called socialism in one country, what Deng Xiaoping called socialism with Chinese characteristics, what Khomeini called not capitalism but Islam, all represent the drive for human progress and growth. In our time, those who seek for society to become wealthier have come to realize that the market, left to its own devices, cannot achieve this. In our time, historical progress requires a strong state that directs a well-organized population having hegemony over the economy. Growth in our time requires that the irrationality of the market be subordinated to a central plan. The means of production must be controlled by society and operated according to a predetermined plan. This allows the artificial restraints of the market to be lifted and human progress to soar forward. Is this the socialism of Friedrich Engels? Yes. The economic vision of Engels is for production upon a predetermined plan and overcoming the anarchy of production. However, does it also contain elements of the socialism of Eugene Düring? Yes. It seeks stability, not chaos. It does not emphasize class struggle, but a collective emancipation of entire nations, and ultimately, the entire human race. In its essence, the socialist movement that has come into existence from 1917 right up to today is neither of the two previous strands of thought. It is the city-building tendency of human history. It is the organized political expression of the innate human drive to advance and reinvent our relationship with our environment. It is expressed in the form of governments that maintain a much more healthy, interactive, and responsive relationship with their populations than those of the democratic West. Engels wrote, "In short, The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. This is the final essential distinction between man and other animals. And once again, it is labor that brings about this distinction. The contradiction between sea-based civilizations and empires that seek to control trade routes and land-based societies that focus on advancing technology and building up productive forces has been widely observed. Lyndon LaRouche promoted this understanding throughout his lifetime as an American political figure, writing about the Eurasian future in his text, Earth's Next 50 Years, published in 2004. Many intellectuals and academics aligned with the governments of Russia and China promote this understanding as well. We can call the form of socialism we see in the world today continental socialism or constructive socialism. It is not focused on intensifying disagreement and antagonism in society in order to drive forward history through contradiction. It is also not focused on imposing authority and restraint while destroying productive forces in order to stabilize the economy. It is rather the expression of human beings and their uniqueness as the tool-making species. Human beings are constantly reinventing the relationship with the natural world, forcing it to serve them in more efficient ways, expanding their population and life expectancy. The socialism of our time is an expression of this inherent human drive in the face of the crisis of outmoded Western imperialism and the rule of profits. This really existing continental socialism is the only antidote to the Atlanticist pathology, the decaying mode of civilization in the West as the internationalist financial system rots within its core. The confused politics of decaying capitalism. The tragic irony is that while 21st century socialism has combined elements of the left and right to move toward more prosperity, the Western capitalist system has pulled the worst elements from the left and the right in its all-out drive to maintain power. Many Trump supporters and right-wingers believe that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are Marxists, and the globalism they espouse is somehow in league with Chinese communists. This is, of course, incorrect. Even in many of the most radical-sounding models espoused by Marxists and democratic socialists in America, profits still remain in command. The irrationality of the market and the problem of overproduction that Engels so poetically describes in this classic text is not overcome. Engels described exactly the problems facing the Western-centered economy in 21st century writing. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians. And it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manuals by a few machine workers, improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. The computer revolution, artificial intelligence, and the huge technological leaps of our time have made capitalism more and more inefficient. Human labor creates value, not machines. The more the role of the worker in production is reduced, the less surplus value the capitalist can extract in profits. The fewer and fewer workers who are hired, the less spending power is in the hands of the consumer. Engels describes this problem in depth writing. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this massive means of production into capital. They lie fallow. And for that very reason, the Industrial Reserve Army must also lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance. But abundance becomes the source of distress and want, foyer, because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital, of the means of production and subsistence, stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of the material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. None of these problems are resolved in the worker cooperative fantasies of bread-tube pseudo-Marxists. None of them would end production organized for profit. For them, socialism is nothing more than an employee stock ownership program, a system where workers receive a share of the profits rather than a set hourly wage. The antagonism between employer and employee, bourgeois and proletarian, is said to be resolved by making the worker a co-owner of his means of production. This is exactly the kind of utopian scheme that Engels explained could not overcome capitalism, as it does not address the fundamental problem of production organized for profit. The solution isn't voluntary worker cooperative enterprises, but rather a centrally planned economy. As Engels explains, this point is now reached. Their political and intellectual bankruptcy is scarcely any longer a secret to the bourgeoisie themselves. Their economic bankruptcy recurs regularly every 10 years. In every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless, face to face with the absurd contradiction that the producers have nothing to consume because consumers are wanting. The expansive force of the means of production burst the bonds that the capitalist mode of production had imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therefore for a practically unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of productive forces and products that are at the present time the inevitable concomitants of production, and that reach their height in the crises. Further, it sets free for the community at large a mass of means of production and of products by doing away with the senseless extravagance of the ruling classes of today and their political representatives. The possibility of securing for every member of society, by means of socialized production, an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now, for the first time, here. But it is here. As Engels explains, this is a struggle for state power and control of government institutions. Engels writes, "The proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, The political authority of the state dies out. Man, at last the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. Yet to the forces who dominate leftist thought in Western countries, this concept is somehow inherently fascist. The notion of mass popular movements seeking to reorganize the economy to serve public good by utilizing state power is labeled fascist and Nazbol. Trump is said to be bad because he resembles Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and other leaders of societies in which the economy is organized in such a manner. The fact that he rallies working people against the power structure is seen as proof that he is evil and a fascist. However, the essence of fascism is degrowth and rigid authoritarian destruction and restraint in the hopes of stabilizing capitalism. This sounds much closer to the ideas espoused by environmentalists and climate alarmists, who scream about the need for reducing the population and consumption. They repeat the claims of neoliberal economists that capitalism is capable of endless growth. They just think this is an inherently bad thing. They see humanity as a dangerous force that must be contained in order to bring the world back into balance with nature, much like Julius Evola. The forces dominating Western society have combined the belief in contradiction and struggle, the drive for instability and chaos one finds in the philosophical side of Marxism, with the contempt for humanity and the desire to contain its creative power found in right-wing anti-capitalism. While 21st century socialism has combined the stronger elements of the left and the right, 21st century capitalism has hijacked the worst elements of Marxism and fascism. There is certainly a dialectical feeling throughout Western civilization, as contradictions between people have never been greater. Families, social organizations, religions, and normal cultural institutions cannot stay together. Every disagreement is exacerbated and intensified by social media and information technology. People fear each other more than ever before. The rage of humans against each other and the lack of group identity and solidarity is more apparent than ever. If struggle was the way civilizations advanced and always led to a higher plane by resolving contradictions, we would be closer to utopia than ever before. The libidinal drive for sex and violence, along with the Oedipal drive for rebellion, are no longer the property of the left as they were in the 19th and 20th century. The most powerful forces in the world have taken hold of them. The forces of wealth and power based in Wall Street and London seek a society where all sense of collectivism and identity is broken down. Everyone is to be an atomized individual who stands alone before society with no religion, creed, identity, or set of principles to adhere to or draw from. In their scheme, each individual is a tabula rasa on which Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix can write whatever socially engineered message they wish to deliver with the algorithm. But what is their plan to stabilize society? It is not socialism and public ownership and planning of the economy. It is rather a rigidly controlled capitalism in which consumption is reduced, growth is restrained, and human beings are engineered like rats in a scientific experiment, fleeing pain and chasing pleasure without self-control or overall vision. They seek to bring the world economy and environment back into balance by reducing human beings to a more and more animalistic plane of existence and reducing the population overall. A mission of universal emancipation. The liberal order employs the rebellion and struggle instincts of the past era's left and the economic methods of the 20th century fascists, all in the hopes of saving an outmoded system of production organized for profit. But Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, and many other countries will not accept their vision. Meanwhile, many working people are being forced by material conditions to depend on each other and come together despite all the mechanisms intended to prevent their solidarity. The labor movement has become more essential than ever in the age of high-tech exploitation in a service sector economy. In addition to that, the lower-level capitalists of the Western countries see the big monopolies as their competitors. Rather than seeking to collapse the US into an open international system, the lower-level capitalists want the domestic US economy to expand so they can enrich themselves. A growing layer of US society stands in contradiction to the degrowth models of the Great Reset, asserting their human drive to live and expand. A global block of resistance, optimism, and innovation exists and is becoming more solid each day. The US labor movement, the unemployed and hungry, the low-level capitalists who want growth, and the rising anti-imperialist bloc around the world all share a common enemy and a common desire. In order to defeat the big monopolies and lift the artificial restraints on human innovation, they will need to unleash popular power and mass movements. Populism is returning in a confused way as the bulk of the working class sees the dark vision of the ultra-rich as intolerable. At the center of the emerging forces of resistance will be the proletariat, those with nothing to sell but their labor power and nothing to lose but their chains. The class of wage workers is the overwhelming majority of the human population, and it is their labor that produces, along with nature, all wealth in society. It will be the involvement of millions of workers in the process of breaking humanity free from the trap of pessimism and profiteering that will be decisive. As Engels wrote, to accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. Bibliography. Solomon Adler, The Chinese Economy, 1957. Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Study in the Banality of Evil, 1963. Mike Billington, Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, The Repression and Promise of the LaRouche Movement, 2000. Earl Browder, The People's Front Against Fascism, 1936. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, 1970. Ha-Jun Chang, Economics, The User's Guide, 2014. George Shirello Mar, We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, 2013. Peter Coffin, Custom Reality and You, 2018. Peter Coffin, Woke Ouroboros, Segregation and Essentialism, 2023. Vince Copeland, Market Elections, How Democracy Serves the Rich. Georgy Dimitrov, The United Front Against Fascism, 1935. Alexander Dugin, The Fourth Political Theory, 2009. R. Palm Dutt, Fascism and Social Revolution, 1934. Michael Eric Dyson, Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina and the Color of Disaster, 2007. Friedrich Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, 1877. Sigmund Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents, 1929. William Z. Foster, Towards Soviet America, 1932. William Z. Foster, The History of the Three Internationals, 1951. William Z. Foster, The Twilight of World Capitalism, 1948. William Z. Foster, In Defense of the Communist Party and Its Indicted Leaders, 1948. Fred Goldstein, Low-Wage Capitalism, What the New Globalized High-Tech Imperialism Means for the Class Struggle in the U.S., 2008. Fred Goldstein, Capitalism at a Dead End, 2012. Linda Gordon, The Second Coming of the Ku Klux Klan, 2018. Yabing Huang, Ideological History of the Communist Party of China, 2021. Soyin Han, The Morning Deluge, 1972. Edward P. Johanningsmeyer, Forging American Communism, The Life of William Z. Foster, 1994. Karl Kautsky, The Foundations of Christianity, 1908. Frank Kitson, Gangs and Countergangs, 1960. Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, 2005. Lyndon LaRouche, There is No Limit to Growth, 1983. Vladimir Lenin, What is to be Done, 1903. Vladimir Lenin, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, 1914. Vladimir Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1916. William S. Lind, The Handbook of Fourth Generation Warfare, 2016. George Lukács, The Destruction of Reason, 1954. Rosa Luxemburg, The Junius Pamphlet, 1915. Michael Parenti, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome, 2003. Mao Zedong, Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Uprisings in Hunan Province, 1926. Lynn Marcus, Lyndon LaRouche, Dialectical Economics, 1974. Sam Marcy, Generals over the White House, 1979. Sam Marcy, Imperialism and the Crisis in the Socialist Camp, 1979. Sam Marcy, High Tech, Low Pay, 1985. John D. Marks, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, The CIA and Mind Control, The Secret History of the Behavioral Sciences, 1991. Karl Marx, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1852. Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto, 1848. Karl Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, 1863. Karl Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program, 1891. Simon Sebag Montefiore, Young Stalin, 2007. Ted Morgan, A Covert Life, J. Lovestone, Communist, Anti-Communist, and Spy Master, 1999. Kenneth E. Morris, The Unfinished Revolution, Daniel Ortega, and Nicaragua's Struggle for Liberation, 2010. Carl Oglesby, The Yankee and Cowboy War, 1978. Tom O'Neill, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, 2020. R. Osborne, Freud and Marx, A Dialectical Study, 1937. Nelson Peary, The Future is Up to Us, 2003. Nelson Peary, Black Fire, The Making of an American Revolutionary, 1994. Nelson Peary, Black Radical, The Education of an American Revolutionary, 2007. Carol Quigley, The Anglo-American Establishment, 1981. Francis Stone Saunders, The Cultural Cold War, The CIA in the World of Arts and Letters, 1999. Benjamin Schwartz, Chinese Communism and the Rise of Mao, 1951. Carlton Sherwood, Inquisition, The Persecution and Prosecution of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, 1991. Joseph Robert Starobin, American Communism in Crisis, 1943 to 1957, 1975. J.V. Stalin, History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course, 1939. Leo Strauss, Persecution in the Art of Writing, 1952. Anna Louise Strong, The Stalin Era, 1956. George Sorel, Reflections on Violence, 1912. Philip Thayer, Europe Since 1989, 2016. Justin Vase, Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Grand Strategist, 2018. Alan M. Wald, The New York Intellectuals, The Rise and Decline of the Anti-Stalinist Left, from the 1930s to the 1980s, 1987. John Weitz, Hitler's Banker, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Shocked, 1997. Joel Whitney, Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Best Writers, 2017. The end. If you want to support the writing of that book, you can. Hang on. I'm going to do that part again. This is the part I'm most nervous about. I know it's goofy, but okay. Let's split. I'm going to put me back on here. I'm going to split this track. This is for the real fans. I'm going back through GarageBand here. Now, I am the kind of person, believe it or not, people, I'm the kind of person that will record that whole book, like 12 hours of a book, and then I will never release it because I don't like how I ask people to support it at the end. So, to not let my crazy perfectionistic anxiety, which this microphone is part of it and needs to be tightened, to not let that get in the way of self-sabotaging, we're gonna do this once. I'm gonna cut it. You get one shot, Tyler McConnell, like Eminem said. You get one shot. Okay, we're gonna cut it right there. The end. Okay, edit. Split region at playhead. Did it do that? No. There, it did it. Okay. All right, here we go. So, the end. Okay, here we go. You get one shot, Tyler. One shot. The end. 1, 2, 3. So if you would like to support the author of that book, do it by buying Caleb Maupin's book. There's a link in the description. You can also support him via his Patreon page, also in the description. Everything's in the description. If you want to support me to create more audiobooks like that, I have a Patreon and a Buy Me a Coffee and a PayPal. All that's in the description. But most importantly, for this book, if you'd like to join a political organization that actually makes you feel like part of a community and you're doing something with your life, not just throwing your money away to one of the two controlled political parties that will never fix anything, join CPI. Join CPI USA. The link is in the description. We'd love to have you, and I'll see you on the next audiobook. Love y'all. God bless. Sounds good to me. Hit save. And now, here's what I do. I'm moving my rig. This thing kills me. I swear I tighten it up and it just doesn't stay. Okay, so I'll just stay and talk to you guys for a while. for a few minutes. It's midnight, man. Hey, thank you, Sherry. Let's see. We got a Liberty, American flag, hammer and sickle. I don't know how you guys. It must be a Unicode or something, but that's cool how you did that. Sherry, you are so welcome. Thank you for staying and listening to me read it. It means a lot. No Blood for Oil said, "Oh my God." And I thought that was somebody being mean, but then later they say, "Thank you." So you're welcome. You said, "Oh my God," like you're so happy that this exists. That's awesome. My comrade Lori stopped by to say hello. Howdy to you, partner. Bravo, you made it to the end. Absolutely. I did. And Sherry Wise says, "Good job." Hey, that's all nice. So, a little update in the YouTube life of Tyler McConnell. I think I can say this. Let's see. I made a short video the other day. I've almost done this. I've almost made a short video every day for a year. And there's a certain gentleman in the I'm afraid to even say it, because once you say the words, even though I said a whole bunch of words on here, so who cares? Let's just say it. Gonzalo Lira is in a Ukrainian prison, and I don't know if he's out. Somebody tell me. But to my knowledge, he's still there. And I had mentioned that in a YouTube short, and it's obvious that once you say those words, it goes into the algorithm, and you get like stomped on for. In my experience, it's like it appears to be. I made one video with a map of the Ukraine and Russia talking about a missile, and they stomped on it. It appears there's like a 10,000 view limit on the shorts. It's been that way for months. I'm on enemy territory right now. I appreciate you, YouTube, for letting me do this at all. So, but it's kind of frustrating, and I don't know why I talked about that. That was kind of on in my head. Other thing I was going to talk about was I'm going to move this equipment back upstairs, and I'm going to buy a room divider of my favorite Monet painting. I'm sure somebody will make fun of me for that, but I really don't care, and I won't read their comment. But that'll help me be on here more because I'll be closer to my family. They don't like me not being around. They say even if if they know I'm just in the other room and they can hear me, they like that more. So it's nice to have a family that wants you to be around, and I want to honor their wishes until as long as I can, because I like being around them too. So that's sweet and means a lot to me. So I'm gonna do that, and I appreciate all the people supporting me. I don't know, unless somehow on YouTube I started making a ton of money. I don't know, but it seems like all the money I make from here will all go back into the channel. I see that, like that room divider is like, I think it's like $180, which I don't really have. It'll come out of the next paycheck, but anything you guys do to help me, I try to put on a better experience for you. You can see up there, one day I'll buy the subscription to StreamYard so that little logo goes away, but I can't really justify like $300 for the logo to go away, especially when you can just use Streamlabs or OBS for free. The only thing I don't like about that is it messes with my ability. Yeah, that's horrible, Lori. I mean, my heart aches for that. It kind of makes me sad that like everyone's just kind of moving on, like there's a little corner of our internet space, and I feel like that should be the only thing they talk about every single day until something's done about it. But you got one, like there was that one question, and the guys, the Biden admin guys, like, yeah, no comment, and that was it. You get to watch his dad cry on Kim Iverson's channel, and it just weighs in my heart. I'm out here walking through the woods, enjoying my freedom, hugging my kids. He don't get to do that. For what? Because he was in because he was in the Ukraine and he said some things they didn't like from his apartment. It's satanic and unconscionable. So weighs on my heart. But yeah, I'm going to start moving everything upstairs, and I don't know really what else to say. This is more Caleb's stream than mine. I just read his book. So it's midnight. I got to work tomorrow. I'm going to hop off here and make sure everything's going okay and locks up tight. Keep the family safe. I love everybody. God bless everybody. I hope you're having a good summer. I got a birthday in a week. I'll be 36. It was his takedown, Sherry. He's got a video where he does a psychoanalysis of what's her, Victoria Newland. I don't know if I can find it real quick. Let me see. Gonzalo. That's the one that made me like really, really like him. I can't find the exact one, but it's somewhere in here. Let's see if I can share this. This was one of them. Just the first one I found was that one in the chat. He has more in that era, right around there. System Pigs, The Daily Beast. That one's a great one. That's a link to it. I'm just going to take just a second and try to find it because it really meant a lot to me. America, you're about to be poor, so please don't lash out at us. Yeah. I don't know. It doesn't show many of them. I think he had multiple channels and they were taken down. But I don't know. If you got some extra time, go back and check out the dude's stuff. He was genius. Really, really smart brother, and he does not deserve what's happening to him. He does whatever you think of him. He does not deserve it. So, it's a hard thing though. Like, I remember before I had a YouTube channel like this, I would hear YouTube people talk about this, and I just thought they were dumb. I don't want to say names of people that annoy me on the internet because I think we're all anybody that has the courage to get on here and kind of speak their truth. I respect that. But good night, Lori. Good night, my friend. But yeah, I mean, you're on enemy territory. What do you expect to happen to you? And then, but you do get this thought, like, should I say it? Should I not? I said it for Gonzalo. We got to get him out. Weighs on my heart. All right, I'm getting sleepy. I'm rambling. So I love y'all. Good. God bless. Good night. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Caleb, for writing an amazing book. I'm going to start waking up. It'll take me about 5 hours to edit this. I got to take a picture of every page and then go through the entire 10 hours and slide each page in at the right part. And you know how it works. You edit stuff. But we'll get it done. And then for posterity, I thought about going back through and fixing every little error. It's like the last thing. I'll get hung up. I did the best I could. We'll get it out there. We'll go on to the next thing. Hopefully you guys will hang out for the next audiobook. I think I'm going to expand. I might do a kind of spiritual book or something a little different. 12 hours of Marxism. I need a break. I need something a little different. Maybe self-help. I don't know. Whatever. I love you guys. Good night. Thanks for listening. Peace.